What we wanted to cover today is the time scale, which is when, and then also which things we're going to measure and then how we're going to measure them. So affected by when is really important because depending on when you measure, you can suffer from the halo effect of like things going really, really well and taking credit for things that are going well, or vice versa. When things are going really badly, you can kind of deflect blame, right? So I think that's why I really love this comic by Tom Fishburne, my cartoonist, because I think that sort of really sums up exactly what it's like to work in this department over a period of time. All your best intentions in place, really, you're kind of almost at the whims of larger forces. So that's really important. Just in case, Stefan, I'm sure if you want to catch up on this and everybody else is watching, please listen to part 1 where we kind of go over a lot of these things. But thanks again for attending because it's a very unpopular topic. Bit of a segue. So I'm going to run you through a bit of a story here. So I think this needs to be said because this really puts everything into context. And I think people are coming at this this topic from different eras. And I would say that there's kind of broadly split into 4 eras here. So pre-2000, so pre-digital, it was all about these big holding companies or agencies. Broadcast media was everything. You had a very captive audience, right? You had inventory that was rare, that when you bought it, it worked really, really well, but you had to pay for it, and pay quite a lot. So it was more of a factor of like, how much are you willing to spend on your marketing, and the incremental effect in your business was pretty much guaranteed to a certain extent, unless you spend it really badly.
What I'd add to that is the ad inventory was rare purely because there were only so many spots available. So you were buying into a slot, and there were only so many slots available. So if you shrunk it down to a city, there were only so many spots you could advertise in that city. So all the spots were booked, and you know, prices went up because demand went up at times, and you were only advertising to a certain amount of people, a certain amount of slots available.
Yeah, so like I always picture it as like this family, or like in front of a TV with a captive audience, in front of like a medium where there was like attention was almost guaranteed. So the quality of the media buy was guaranteed as well. So that attention effect and that memory sort of burning effect was very much reliable. What happened then at the end of that sort of, I would say the later end of the 90s and early 2000s, was digital media came in. I remember a friend of mine being on stage when Google came onto stage in roller skates in 1999 and go, hey, we're Google, you know, we have a search engine and blah, blah, blah. So I think what happened then is that these traditional media got disrupted by search and social media in many different forms over a long period of time. So we've got a 15-year time period here. But the way you bought media was very different. It was an RTB, or live auction bidding purchase when you bought your media. It's very different to pre-buying it like months or years in advance. And obviously, you know, SaaS was very vogue. It was all about inbound marketing. HubSpot was sort of like the mantra there. Instead of going out to the market, use those people who are in market, capture them and bring them into your website and convert them into a sale is kind of the thing that was sold to a lot of firms. And obviously there was the start of that sort of anti-spam movement as well. So that basically happened 15 years.
One point to add to that was it was the introduction of you pre-2000, you were always advertising to a human. Now you're advertising, there's a chance you're advertising to not a human.
Yeah, depending on how you set up the parameters, correct. Yeah, exactly. So that sort of like spam or anti-spam sort of movement really came in. I remember doing SEO for Google many years ago. Well, sorry, to optimize for Google. And I remember just like it was a constant war between the things that you could exploit versus the things that crack down on. I think the thing that really changed though was really a pivotal moment in 2016, 17, I would argue. So Stefan, you probably know GDPR came in the EU in 2016. GPT-1 was released in 2018 actually. Apple ATT, so app tracking transparency, really changed the game around mobile tracking in 2021. That basically meant that 30-40% of all your traffic, the signal had been cut. There's an estimation from that point on. You couldn't rely on that data. And then the zero interest rate period really ended in May 2022 as well, which we'll look at a graph in a minute. So basically a lot of these SaaS models and GTM functions and the whole sort of tech bubble was funded by a very cheap financing that happened really 15 years, and then has reversed extremely suddenly in 2022, which I'll show you the graph in just a minute. ChatGPT came out in 2022, COVID era ended, so that sort of like bubble of using tech really ended in 2023, and then a lot of people were forced in-house as well over that period. So there's a bit of adjustment period. I would say post 2022, this new era is very different. So, but before we get to that, this is the Fed rate in the US. So you can kind of see here this period from basically 2008-9 to 2022, almost 0% interest rates. So what that means is that you've had a 15-year period of businesses being funded and their models being funded via cheap money or debt financing. So you could basically create a business model and sustain it because you could fund it very cheaply with debt for a long period of time. So I think the important takeaway here is that most of our careers, if you've grown up in any of that period, have been in a very artificial environment that, as you can see here on the right-hand side, has reversed very rapidly since the sort of early 2022 period back to the long-term average of about 5%. A lot of companies have to readjust to that, and I think a lot of the growth strategies as well have had to readjust. But we're still in that sort of messy.
Cheap money gives you cheap expectations, really.
It
so
does.
a lot of things got you get away with things because you can borrow at such a low rate. Now it's not easy to borrow money, so the expectations or the return has to be real and has to be justified.
Well, exactly. I mean, anyone can grow revenue, right? This is actually a really famous saying, like any idiot can grow revenue in a business by selling at a loss, right? You could go, hey, I'll sell this thing for $10 and I'll give you $12 for it, right? And instantly I can grow revenue, right? With this like future growth expectation. That is not hard. Now what's really happened is a reversal of like this sort of cost benefit ratio of like profitable growth as opposed to growth at all costs. So the double whammy has not just been the reduction in interest rates, but a petering and a leveling of the worldwide internet usage. So this is kind of like what we'd call the TAM, really, or total addressable market of anyone who's like in tech or AI selling anything. It's really leveled off for the last couple of years to the saturation point of about 68% of internet, and this is the US as well. A similar kind of curve, right? And it's definitely hit that sort of diminishing returns in that sort of 2020 period. Added to that, it's not even just leveling off, but there's some things like social media as a channel has actually reduced. So here's some interesting data from Financial Times. You can look up this article, but you can see a reduction in like arguably like young cohorts here going, well, I'm going to use less social media, but it's across all cohorts, but probably more pronounced in the youngest cohorts here. So you're getting a reduction of the growth rate. It's a negative, which is very interesting. And you've probably seen some of these side effects in things like LinkedIn. But another thing that's happened, triple whammy, is that most people know that a lot of the internet traffic is fraudulent or bot generated. But what happened really, depending on the study that you listen to, but you can see here on the right-hand side, 2024, the majority of internet traffic is basically bad bots or bots. So the problem here, and the takeaway is that if you are listening to digital analytics and optimizing around those signals, you're basically optimizing for bots, not humans, which automatically will crimp any of your revenue expectations, which is a huge problem.
So it's the end of the free money train. So expectations are coming in. People are spending less time on social media than they had before. At the same time, the category of the internet is not growing anymore.
No.
So something has to go down. If your numbers aren't going down, you have to question why.
Yeah, and the majority of signal is like like unhuman or inhumane. So like you got to be super careful. And maybe that's where this whole what's the dead internet theory is coming from, like this moniker of AI.
The dead internet theory says the majority of the internet is going to be bots talking to bots, producing content for bots.
Optimizing for bots, instead of humans. Yeah, which is great for bots, but if we're trying to make some money, it is a terrible idea.
Trying to get people to buy stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the third whammy on this last 2 years is the adoption of AGI systems. So you can see here the sort of growth rate of adoption of ChatGPT. This is just the biggest one in the market, which basically has 60% market share. But you can see the phenomenal nonlinear growth rate here from really that 2024 period to to this year, where it's really jumped up. We've got this huge saturation of AI as well. Actually, most people using AI are male under the age of 34. Interesting. If you're optimizing for AI, just be very careful of that. If your base is female and older, especially, you could be in a world of pain.
And
But
also in an area where they don't have a lot of money. There's a lot of 18 to 34-year-olds don't
exactly.
spend on things. The buying power is older.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? So you can kind of see here how low the usage is in that sort of like 55 to 65 cohort versus 18 to 24. So, there's a lot of buzz around this, but I mean, does it translate to money? Well, depends. I think the combined effect of all those triple whammies, I would call, is the SaaS reckoning. So SaaS is software as a service, or software companies. So really the average growth rate here is in percentage terms, and you can see this decline from left to right, starting in 2015 all the way to the second quarter of 25, where we're sort of almost going to single figure growth rate, which is basically on par with other normal businesses. So that whole COVID bump did give us a bit of a reprieve, but it's definitely been rectified in the last couple of quarters. So basically, SaaS is dead. And by the way, this is public SaaS companies, but it's very dire out there if you're running that sort of growth method that's dominated for the last 15 years in a software company. You can kind of see this ultimate irony. I love this graph. So Matt, this is the lower thing is all public sort of SaaS companies, right, in terms of their CAC payback period. So what that means is that the cost of acquiring a customer, how long does it take to pay back that? So if it costs me $200 and my annual subscription is $200 of that customer, the CAC payback period would be 1 year, for example, or 12 months. So you can kind of see here the disparity over months of literally, this is the irony here, is that the top line is GTM or MarTech that is supposed to make it easier to acquire customers. Their payback period is like above average compared to the average of public SaaS companies. So that just means that the people selling you marketing software are basically below par when it comes to acquiring customers, which is very interesting.
2-year payback period is crazy as well.
Yeah.
The churn rate is that's difficult numbers to work with.
Bringing to this era right now, which is, I would argue, 2024 to today, is that search marketing is basically dead. So that whole inbound HubSpot era is like very much dead. You probably noticed on LinkedIn and other social media that the yields from organic reach is extremely small. So that sort of TikTok halo effect from 2019 gone. Probably can't get viral anymore. LinkedIn posts default reach very, very low. We're also seeing a reversal of companies like software companies putting all the money back into events, actually. So I saw a report that 30% of all budgets on average for SaaS companies are in events. So personal activation. I think that's sort of like synonymous with this whole shift back to what we call brand marketing, which we'll talk about in a minute, and that sort of 4P fundamentals as opposed to that digital marketing or communications way to grow a company. Yeah, and basically AI has made the barriers to content creation almost zero. So that basically devalues the creative itself and puts a lot of more value into the media buy and nuance around who that creative is seen by and the effect it has in the audience, as opposed to creating content in the first place. So that whole sort of content marketing thing is dead as well. In-housing is big, and MMM is basically reversed as well. So what was Vogue in the 1950s is back again.
The barrier to entry for content is, it was already pretty low, but now it's gotten extraordinarily better and much lower to even enter. Produce more crap faster.
Yeah, exactly. So basically it means it has no value. Okay, so that was a brief segue into like where we are right now. But I think there's a common thing. This went kind of pretty viral actually when I posted on LinkedIn and Twitter around when you ask a brand marketer, hey, what did that actually do commercially? What was the impact on revenue and sales, that kind of thing? They kind of have a bit of a fit. And I think that's interesting because no one really argues that, hey, you've got to water the plant to harvest the fruit at a later point in date, right? But it's that time scale and how much water over what period of time and how much fruit you can get. That is the important thing, right? So I don't think this whole invest in a long-term thing is in conjecture. It's more about time scale that many marketers are not good at communicating. Here's a good example of what we call nonlinear growth. So this is a a fintech company called Airwallex. You can kind of see here their monthly revenue in the millions in US dollars. It sort of took like 80 months for them to like really kick up. And then you see this huge nonlinear growth curve, right? So it's not a linear left to right 45-degree kind of thing. And here's another example from one of my favorite podcasts, Acquired podcast. You can kind of see here in blue, that's all the episodes that are released and the names of those episodes, or the bigger ones labeled there. But you can kind of see the same sort of like relationship here. But I think the problem here is that we go, when it comes to marketing measurement, we've got these long-term burn things that sort of happen in the background, which I don't think anybody argues about, right? Maybe some people call it brand or whatever, or brand advertising, fine. And there's the other things that give you the shorter sort of sweet boosts as well, that are more pronounced but then decay really quickly. Some people call those direct response or performance marketing, right? So you've got this duality that sort of happens in real time. Why that's important to marketing effectiveness is when it comes to measurement, because if I have a non-linear growth curve, like I just showed you with Airwallex and the Acquired podcast, this is what we call an S-curve, which is kind of how products rise and fall. If I measure in this time period, I would say, oh, that was pretty unsuccessful if I was a CFO, right? And similarly, if I went to the tail end, where it's hitting diminishing returns, I would say also, that marketing spend was unsuccessful. If I measure it anywhere in this period, though, I would say, hey, that was really good ROI, or return on investment. And then the second thing we ask is like, hey, what happened here? Which is a very natural question to ask, but often nothing really happened there. It was just a continuation of 10 or 18 years prevailing that led up to this breakout period that then created this growth curve. But I think a lot of the signals we get in the marketing world is like, hey, we go, well, Apple did this ad in 1997, right, this green point, so that was the catalyst for their whole growth period. But that's probably not a good way of talking about it. And yeah, I think that's why I really like what Henry said about this book, The Long and the Short. Have you read this, Matt, or not?
I think when it came out, but I haven't read it in a while.
Yeah, so I just found it very interesting. So just for context, Henry is the CEO and founder of Mutant X's and MM platform, which is like worldwide, but I think it's based in Sydney, but very big in New York as well. And he basically says like, hey, this whole argument about long versus short is taken out of context to kind of position these short-term sales bumps as something that's kind of like a dirty salesy kind of thing, as opposed to viewing it that the long term is a series of these short-term bumps in concept with one another over a long period of time, which creates this non-linear sort of long-term growth effect. And that's a better way of thinking about it. And yeah, interesting. Matt, you read this book and you said they don't actually define long and short.
They don't. If you go through any of those books and the long and short of it, and you peer through it and you try and get a definition of business effects, either the large business effects or any business effects, they're not really mentioned. And then the short term, the long term, I think that's the only defined measure that goes in there. But I can't agree more with this article. The long term is a series of short terms. It's really
Layered on top of one another. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I really like what Dale Harrison has here. He's basically created a post about this if you want to go and view him. But a lot of the long and short doesn't really take into effects of the diminishing returns and then just decay effect of memories. So no matter what you do, there's like a decay. So that's what these sort of yellow lines are here, if we want to zoom up on them. So he's redrawn that lower image here, which is the one off the book, Long and the Short. Is it Les Binet and Peter Field?
Yeah, Les Binet and Peter Field.
Yeah, so they've got this like sort of picture down the bottom left, but like he's then redrawn it for the realities of how it actually works.
You've got memories that decay because people forget who you are. You've got to build them over time,
and you get diminishing returns as well.
Yeah, it's not going to happen over the one period, and you've also got to build in the decay effects of how people are likely to plan for campaigns and put them out into the world. Because it'd be nice if you could have them sustained all the year round, but it's just not possible. It's not feasible in political landscapes as well.
And any channel investment that you do, so if it's like sort of green line here, like you may saturate that over a period of time and you hit diminishing returns. So like there's no sort of linear effect to the top right that just keeps on going and going. You basically got to keep layering channel investments on top of one another into this like S curves on top of S curves to create that sort of linear effect to the top right. I think that's probably a really important takeaway that short is usually long, and long is short added over time. So there is basically no long, just a series of shorts.
Yeah. There's no such thing as long. It's all short. Make sure you know what it's going to do if it's going to do something.
And I'll show you some really good graphs about that, actually. So that sort of brings us to the point of like, what is brand? So I did that study around like, what is marketing, what is brand, which we covered in part 1. But one of the other questions I asked is like, what is brand? And I tabulated that. So here's a word cloud of the answers from that study. And it's very interesting. The results on that are very different to maybe how marketers may describe brands. So again, I was looking at a control group of the population, non-marketers as well as marketers. So marketers only made up 30% of this sample. And most people described it as customer, product, and company. So it's very much like, what are you selling? And then who are you selling it to, from whom, is sort of like how people describe brand. I had this interview with Matt Wilson, very interesting guy actually from UK. And he said, we were talking about sort of like business wisdom, and he was talking about Taylor, who's basically invented this sort of business scientific method. And he just said, like, a lot of this stuff is a fraud, right? So he's like, the things that actually become popular in business and lexicon are basically like a combination of two very amorphous nouns or verbs that are put together that nobody really knows what they are because they're vague by design so that you can sell them as a vendor, right? It's not about actually knowing what they are. It's about just getting across the line and selling it to unassuming buyers who are the people representing the company. And he's like, once you see this, you can't unsee it. And I'd argue that's extremely true. I would say that while many people may know the difference between these two things, well, that's assuming a lot. What does that mean? I don't know. How would you describe that, Matt?
I've seen this list, and you like the brand and branding. It's really easy. The brand marketing, it gets vague.
Okay.
Someone says it's the long-term part of the advertising. Oh, but then you say brand advertising, and
Well, it's the difference between brand advertising and brand marketing. I mean, that's a interesting conversation. And then my favorite is like brand campaign, as opposed to what? A non-brand campaign or an unbranded campaign. And then we got brand building, as opposed to what? Non-building brand campaigns.
And brand refreshing.
Brand refreshing. I don't know. And then that's probably my second most favorite is brand performance marketing. So like when in doubt, just put the two extremes together and mash them into one. And then I think the other one is a variation of that, which is direct response mixed with brand. That is a term that's actually being floated around at the minute as well. So my point is, like, once you see these things, like, what do these actually mean? If you want to explain to somebody, how would you explain the difference between those last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, especially? Very difficult. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a big difference between marketing that's effective to the bottom line and marketing that's actually sellable as a vendor or actually internally within a company. They're two very, very different things often.
That vague by design is interesting, because if you drill down to vendors who sell you, we build mental availability, and you sort of poke them on it a little bit, it gets lost really quickly.
Yeah, what does that mean?
They lose, that's why I did a lot of work in category entry points, because they were literally one step down from building mental availability. But if you ask them what it was, it didn't work.
So I think the point here is that we have to be really careful about the things that are sold, because the things that were sold are likely the most ineffective things by virtue, which is a very funny paradox, really, when you think about it. Really interesting person, Tim Doyle, if you look at him, is Aussie founder for a tech firm. I think he makes a good point here on this topic around long versus short term. Is like the people who defend brand advertising are generally people who are terrible at measuring brand. A lot of the brand marketers I talk to have no idea about how to measure brand. They all maybe quote, like you said, brand availability or awareness or something like that, but they have no idea how to actually measure that metric. So he's like, historically, you need to get better at measuring, and there's no such thing as like brand marketing. It's just not a thing, which I think is a very contrarian sort of point of view, but kind of makes a good point. What do you think?
And to add to it, all advertising has an effect. It's just how much and over what time period. And it's always less than you want it to be, and not over the time period you want it to happen.
Yeah.
So it just, if you have a brand marketer, they need to set expectations, but they need to set expectations at the right commercial level so that you can, build it at the time rate that makes sense for your career and your brand.
And then I think the crux of that is really this quote by Jenny Remenuk. So a lot of people who, fight for these brand building campaigns or brand campaigns don't realize, and actually, these people are also sort of quite partial to the Arabo Bass Institute. They don't realize some really what some of the people there think about brand campaigns, and this is what Jenny thinks about it. So Jenny, just so you know, is basically really the person behind the whole institute. Like most people would know Byron Sharp, but she's the person that does the actual work underneath. Not to say that Byron doesn't do it, but she's the big person, and this is what she thinks about brand building campaigns. I think it says everything, really.
Own goals.
Definitely an own goal. Hopefully, we've just covered in the last video what and who, but we just sort of talked about when, so over what time scale. And again, it really depends like what segment of time within that time scale that you want to measure, or what we call like a time window, and just knowing the sort of nonlinear effects and how to sort of project those. But we'll now move on to metrics. So which metrics? Very simple. I can basically stop right now and you can go about your merry ways, but it's all about incremental impact. So everyone in the middle is arguing over different measurement platforms, different metrics, whatever. That's really secondary, to be honest. Most executives go, hey, if I spend money on marketing, what do I get above and beyond otherwise would have been the case without that spend? And that's kind of the crux of the measurement that you need to, the question that you need to answer for executives. That doesn't change from small to large businesses. I think what gets sort of like merged in the middle is that sort of bureaucracy or that compensation for lack of incrementality. What do you think, Matt?
I find this a perfect Dunning-Kruger chart, because when I went to university, they kind of taught you incremental impact. It was a long time ago when I went to university, but CTR, engagement, awareness was there, but leads and all that kind of stuff, and CAC and lifetime value, they weren't taught because they were just coming up as a concept. But now, like, they taught you incremental impact and how to measure that properly. And then I went into my career and I was like, oh, I thought they were teaching me what I need to know, but this is what they actually taught me, because I went straight into a big advertising firm straight away, which then after many years, I went back to incremental impact, which was
basically
what they originally taught me, and my university was correct and I was wrong for all those years.
And it's funny because if you talk to like a sort of a tradie or sort of contractor, a business like a laborer on that left-hand side, they were like, hey, here's my budget and I want some customers from it, right? So if you can get a couple of customers, I'll do a crude incrementality sort of test, and then that's how I measure marketing effectiveness. So it's very simple, right? That's exactly how it works. And then really that's how it works on the high end as well. You got to really know your baseline though. So like what would have happened otherwise, I think, is the thing that makes it really hard to measure. I asked also in that same survey, how do you know if your marketing is being effective or not? And overwhelmingly, you can see here by the top line, people referred to revenue and growth metrics or bottom line impact as being the number one way you would measure marketing effectiveness. And then right down the bottom was those hard to measure impacts, like such as arguably what most people deem brand. So it's literally the fifth. So there's a very interesting sort of duality that happens here around marketing measurement. So moving on, I think it's also reflected in this study. So the Data and Marketing Association UK, very interesting. They've done this study a couple of years in a row. I think they've stopped it now, actually, but they basically asked people, how do you measure marketing effectiveness? And what metrics are you going to use for that? And you can kind of see here from right to left that most people start with that sort of campaign level things like reach, frequency, impressions, engagement, whatever. And then the second most is like the actual behavioral impact of that. So did they fill out a form, or did they call, or did they enter our store? And then the third least was those brand effects. So, those long-term sort of intangibles. And then least of all, basically 92% of people don't measure bottom line impact of marketing spend. That is a huge percentage.
I don't know how you can be a marketing effectiveness person without talking about profit, sales, market share, penetration, loyalty is if you've lost any, and price sensitivity, which is, that one's super hard to measure as well. But the profit and sales, come on, you got to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you want to be popular, you just talk about the 92%, really, which
talk about the reach.
Yeah, a lot of commentators, that's what they focus on. These things around distinctiveness and mental availability and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, like people really don't care about that at senior levels. Interesting. You know this study, don't you, Matt, around advertising. So what effect does advertising have on sales is always the thing that comes up. Lots of studies around this. This is one of the most interesting ones that I know Ethan Decker told me about. And this is a post from him. And this was a study around these cities that were basically, there was a state line between the middle of the city. So kind of like, Washington, D.C., so the borders two states. There was a couple of cities in America where you could basically buy media, but only get half of the city. So it was basically one of the most pure split tests in existence that you could do. And they basically just like measured incrementality over those two geographic areas. And this is the result.
I mean, I'm not surprised, but it's a tough conversation to have when you talk about like a sales response. The 65% have no effect. 0.4% is the best effect you could possibly have. But at the same time, it depends on how you have that conversation.
Yeah. So the majority of your advertising basically does nothing. So almost, 2/3, almost like 66% would be 2/3. So yeah, and then the high end, I mean, high is actually not that high when it comes to incremental impact. So this is why a lot of marketers don't want to measure bottom line impact, because it has no impact.
The flip side to that is if you stop advertising, you do see effects over time. It just depends on when you're willing to have that conversation.
So, and that brings us to this one, is around the baseline. So this study by ABI said, hey, if we stopped everything that we were previously doing, what is the lag effect of that decline, right? And basically it means that if you've got a large brand, that lag is like very small. So you can kind of see this yellow line at the top. And this is years, basically on the y-axis down the bottom right. Sorry, x-axis. Really, after 3 years, you've only seen like a 10% decline if you're a large brand. But if you're medium or small, it's a decline is a bit more rapid, right? But the point is, like, really, if you stopped advertising, it doesn't really do much.
But the whole thing is, a lot of advertising is, the effect is to stay in the same place. And,
yes.
And it turns out it's very difficult to stay in this. It's easier to stay in the same place, but it's hard to justify staying in the same place.
Yeah, I think this is the crux of the point, isn't it? It's like most marketing by these measurements are about keeping us exactly where we are and not having any incremental sort of impact or growth, right? So by virtue, most of our experiences are around marketing that keeps us in the same place, as opposed to being deemed effective.
But it's hard to stay in the same place. There's an advertiser here in Australia called Optus who keep failing at doing the basics of doing business, and that's why they're declining. Yeah, you can do all the advertising you want in the world to stay in the same place, but everyone else is gobbling up the market share of Optus losing, purely because they're failing to do the thing that they need to do, which is, operate a business successfully.
Yes, I actually know the business pretty well. There's some very interesting circumstances behind the business, but moving on. The point is, like, growth is extremely small. So when we talk about FMCG or CPG companies, so a lot of these brands are the ones that marketers like to post about around advertising. This is a high growth rate. So this is penetration. So penetration means the gross number of customers you have in any contained market relative to your competitors, right? So 1% or 1.2% means that you have an extra 1% customer base that other people don't have. These are some major brands. Basically, if you're growing at 1%, that's high growth, basically.
I'd be happy if a lot of the brands I work for grew by 1%. I'd be really happy with that. As if they grew by the amount of customers by 1%, it's still a large amount.
Yeah. Again, this is not revenue or profit or anything. This is just like penetration. This is like a good scatter plot of that penetration effect. So basically, most companies, you kind of see the 69% here on the other side of zero. So the lower half of zero, meaning they've lost market penetration or brand penetration. The top half meaning they're gaining it. So most brands do not grow or decline by a large percentage each year. Those outliers in the far top and bottom of that graph are the ones that are probably most interesting to talk to and seeing what they're doing. And here is the US's biggest advertiser. So the top, 60? So we've got 30 and 30 here. So CAGR is basically compound annual growth rate. What does that mean? It means if I measure the revenue in 2009 here on the third column versus 2024, so 15-year period. I would then average out that growth rate compounding. So it's not a linear growth rate, so compounding growth rate. I would then give that percentage, which is that column second from the right-hand side here, showing you that a lot of these biggest advertisers in the world basically do not grow very much at all.
Yeah, there's some brands, like you've got huge ones in there, like even they've just
Yum Brands,
declined by
what's KFC?
0.7%. GSK, I mean, you got the big brands like Amazon and Facebook, but that's them growing with the category as they're growing with the category, right?
McDonald's 0.9. That's like terrible. 15 years and they grow less
10
than
years and they've
1%.
grown 1%.
I mean, and they win a lot of awards, you would argue, for marketing, advertising.
A lot of these brands win a lot of awards for marketing.
Well, as do Sanofi. I mean, there's a heaps of brands in
Coca-Cola.
there. Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, Pfizer. Wow. I mean, they even got caught up in that whole halo effect from COVID. So very interesting to see that growth rate being so low.
Yeah, even AstraZeneca, only 3.4%.
So I think the point here of these last couple of slides is to temper the expectations of your CFO when they give you a very ambitious growth target when you're entering a marketing position of 20% or whatever. Like basically, if it's over 2%, be very, very, very careful about accepting that. Like definitely push back using these data. And that brings us to this whole point of hey, how do I measure marketing? A lot of people use this word called ROI, or return on investment. What they really mean is like a payback period. ROI, actually, very interesting. So DuPont was a company back in 1910 that created this term, and it was about a return on physical machinery. Which was a physical asset, right? So basically it was a efficiency metric around inputs versus outputs of machinery. And it ignores time, valuation, risk, and any intangible assets by virtue. The other probably more important thing for market is that it's much easier to decrease the denominator, i.e. cut your budget, than it is to increase the denominator, i.e. revenue. And you quickly find out that to be the case. So a lot of budgets are cut and then the ROI goes up. It's the easiest thing you can ever do. So it's very much a linear kind of thing. And what they really mean is financial payback. So this financial payback is probably the better term to use. But in case you want to do ROI, there's the formula down there in the bottom left. What you should probably use the term is this one, and it's about how long it takes to recoup your investment. So it's an effectiveness metric, not an efficiency metric. There's a big difference between the two. Basically, it answers the question of, did the money that we allocated to this thing give us a return? And if so, over what time period can we expect it to come back? So this really accounts for this longer time period and nonlinear longer term growth effects that really, I would argue, a lot of marketing investments are exposed to. So that's the term that I would use. This is the form there right here. And I would, definitely push back if anyone says, what's the ROI of this? What's the ROI of that? I mean,
what's the ROI for fixing a damaged roof?
Yeah, exactly.
But it's much easier to justify a financial payback of a roof instead of the ROI. You need the roof to do business. It's gonna hurt us if we don't do it.
Yeah, what's the ROI of an employee? Or a frontline customer service agent. I mean, how do you calculate that? It's a terrible way to think about it. If you're using the left-hand side of things. So a lot of service firms are really, I would say, more pronounced when it comes to this problem here of left versus right. So this is a study that was done by this firm, John Webb, managing partner for Game Theory. So this is published in Work. But these curves are basically advertising campaigns of CPG firms or fast-moving consumer good firms, showing you that this one on the y-axis would be 100% return on investment. A lot of them sort of at about 56 weeks. So at about 1 year, you'd mostly get a lot of your thing back. The curve velocity really depends on the company and how good the creative is, etc. But you can kind of see this very interesting shape here where it sort of curves up, hits this half-life, and then sort of peters off. Very interesting study here, how long it takes to pay back your advertising. Matt, have you seen those kind of curves or not?
Yeah, you don't normally see them because you have to have a good effective your advertising elasticity for a long time. So that's why it's done in CPG. I've heard from some people saying that CPG is one of the last bastions of marketing because they actually have proper integrated marketing teams. Like it'd be really nice to have that light blue area, but
Yeah,
it'd be good to show a graph at all.
yeah, exactly. And you kind of see here this like the first sort of 50%, really, the half-life happens very rapidly within a couple of weeks, right? And then the curve flattens.
That goes back to the half-life of advertising exists everywhere. Know what it is for you, and that's why the long term actually has to be measured in a series of short-term bursts of activity you've done over time.
Really good thing you bring up, because we'll look at that in just a minute around the half-life of advertising, because there's a lot of studies done on that as well, so you can predict it. But just quickly, let's answer your question: which metrics do you want to use? I really like this Swedish standard they have here, marketing effectiveness, around these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sort of like subcategories. So business, brand, relationship, campaign, digital, and media investments. I would probably sort of look at this in a similar way, although I would maybe change personally some of the names of these metrics, but I think it's a good way of like holistically looking at like a broader range of ways to measure marketing. What do you think, Matt?
And also, you have to realize that some people, their job is to measure only the purple area, and their job isn't to measure the red area. It's good to know what the red area is, but you have to sometimes know that you're in the purple area alone. Same thing with the blue being the campaign metrics. Like, if I'm the person in charge of making sure the ad is understood, that's the measure I'm going to kind of use to make sure it's understood. Do people know what the hell the ad is about? Do they understand the brand? Do they even know what my brand is? Do they know what we're selling? Depends on how you go. But I agree with most of them here. There are a few that I would cross out.
Yeah, same. But I think it's a good way of like sort of try to look at the gamut of, I would say, subcategories of measurement, and sort of figure out which ones you want to go deeper on, depending on.
And if you put them into the errors that you had earlier in the presentation, it's like a lot of these are new, as in they've only been around for like since maybe 2015, maybe. And you know, the plethora of measurement you have to deal with now is comprehensive.
Yeah, like 2.5, for example, wouldn't existed pre-2000, really, in a way. Terra search, for example. Yeah, good point. If you want to get up to speed with how to measure brand, I did a free course here for the benefit of everyone. So go to VexPower, search for brand health tracking. You can do this course around the basics of how to measure brand, because I think a lot of people use brand as a bit of a moniker for, oh, well, it didn't produce sales, but it did produce brand effects, therefore it's justified. But how do you measure brand? A lot of people can't describe it. Go here so you can learn the basics. Let's get in the crux of this. It's really hard to explain to you how to measure marketing effectiveness without knowing which industry you're in, how big your brand is, what position you're in, etc. So I'm going to give you some sort of general mental models or frameworks to apply that I think, from my experience, are extremely effective, that apply to all organizations. And then I think within those sort of frameworks or ways to attack something, you can then create something that really works for you. So let's go through 9 of these right now. The first is viewing your audience. I think there's a default to go, hey, I want this marketing to affect my customers. But exactly who are your customers? If you've ever played blackjack or poker before, sometimes you have the person playing the cards and you have people back betting on that, and you have another people back betting on those people. So I would view your effects in a similar way when it comes to marketing. So there's the people you want to affect immediately who are sort of in the game, and there's a secondary and a tertiary audience, which is a lot larger, sitting behind those people. I'll just give you one example. I was doing a recent campaign to try to get department heads to use this kind of software as opposed to another brand of software. So really my primary target market was the department head or CMO of companies around the world. But also the people who would sign off on that software were procurement people, executives, the buying committee if they had one, and other employees within that department who would be using that software. So really my secondary audience was very big, but just as important as the primary person that I was targeting. And then again, my tertiary audience from this, I would argue, would be my own employees and my line boss and partners within the ecosystem, who I also had to appease to make sure that, hey, I was doing a good job and I was effective and the brand was getting out there, for example. So when it says what is effective, well, it really depends like who we're measuring, right? And I would say that stakeholder group is a lot more complex than most people talk. So point is, I would view your audience as like maybe layers or primary, secondary, tertiary, or even more, rather than just one default group.
It'd be nice if we could just go 18 to 34. We don't care about anything else.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, if you want to get better yield, maybe you didn't have big effect on your department heads, but then you had a really good effect on your secondary audience, which then influenced the department head. Or we're very influential, like creating partner opportunities, whatever. Like they're still a valuable group. So I think, a lot of measurement doesn't really account for that secondary and tertiary audience, which a lot of your yield can go to.
A lot of CPG is advertised to the mum, but the kid is the one who convinced the mum to buy it.
Yeah. Or the person, the stocker, the buyer, we call it, the brand buyers at these firms. So, okay, so another mental model that I'd really encourage people to think about is like, I play pool or snooker, right? So you hit a ball, that ball hits another ball, and you want to go in the pocket. Sometimes you hit a ball, it hits another ball, that ball hits another ball and goes in the pocket, right? So I call these like first, second, and third order effects. So we're kind of talking about game theory here. Like I do something that has affected something else. What is the effect on that on somebody else, and so on and so forth? Here's a really good way of thinking about it. So if I'm doing a marketing campaign, maybe the immediate effect is like I've got some followers, engagement, traffic, inquiry, sales, or I've got some people filling out some forms. Great. I'll call those first order effects. Second order effects of the campaign may be that, hey, now I've got a first party data repository that I can then use to retarget or use for direct marketing purposes or DM pieces, whatever. I then will learn, hey, what creative was better than the other one that we used before. I could calculate yields. I might get a referral effect, or partners may start to notice and go, hey, we should do an event together or do a collab. I would call those second order effects. And then tertiary effects or third order effects would be, okay, what happens after that? I could do some follow-up communications, some budget optimization. I get a word of mouth referral effect, other things. This is not a great breakdown, I have to admit, but the point is I'm thinking in terms of like, I do something that has this immediate effect, and then I have a secondary effect, and then something else, and so on and so forth. And I think about the measurement in that frame. Yeah.
I don't think many people think in those kinds of ways. I think they think in terms of
Just
like
first.
We want the first one, and then we don't think about the second or third order effect that comes off the back of it. I think your example next is really good too.
Okay, so here's an example. So if I was doing a B2B campaign, which I do a lot of, I would say, hey, my output was like, we got a lot of reach, we got website traffic, we got some sales leads coming in via whatever form, whatever, right? I call those first or primary order effects. Then what happens after that is that, hey, we get opportunities coming through, we got recall about our brand, if we're doing some brand measurement pieces. Maybe the thing that I'm doing, like for example, it's really good customer testimonial that I created. It was a video of a customer talking about the brand, and then I was using that retargeting on YouTube and LinkedIn. And what I found that did was it actually helped close our deals at a higher rate and quicker than all the other records that we had recorded before. So, for example, if the close time was normally like 12 weeks, it basically halved to 6 weeks. And then the value of those and the objections we got were a lot less. So it had this very subtle, like you would argue a brand effect, right? But really, really important, very subtle. And unless you're measuring those things, it'd be completely off your radar. And you say, well, that testimonial didn't do anything. So I think it's really interesting, this subtle sort of revenue sort of amplifier effect. So a lot of people would lump to brand. And then like third order effects, here's a really good example. So value leverage. I would then say, hey, we've got this first party data, this list, let's do a collab together, a webinar or whatever. Now you have cred because you've got this list to deal with. That attracts partners. You can leverage that fame to close those deals, leverage people talking about you, earn media. You may attract employees. You may have other vendors sort of approach you, and your shareholder and board will probably go, hey, we've seen your stuff and it looks like you're doing a good job. And that has a lot of effect and taking a lot of pressure off some of the key stakeholders in the department. So it's interesting when you're going effective, well, for whom, over what time scale. That's just one example of the complexity of it.
I think a lot of that kind of stuff isn't covered a lot of the time. We
No.
usually when they go the second and third order effect, they usually say, oh yeah, there's clicks on the website, but then you can go a little bit deeper than that. The compressed sales time, how many people actually started buying something, the time they went through the website overall, like trying to break down the cohorts of people who were successful, there's always some nugget about second and third order effect that are not considered. But the B2B example is really good, but B2C, there's stuff in that area too.
Yeah, similar. Yeah, exactly. So third thing I'd probably look at, and we're kind of alluding to this, is like these leading and lagging indicators. So if you are doing economic modeling, or you're working government for economic modelers or statisticians, they'll talk about these sort of things that predict the future and things that lag what's actually happening at any one point in time. So we've got these leading and lagging indicators. I would say that when I'm doing effectiveness measurement, I would always put these two things in line. CFOs really love this because then they can forecast more accurately what's actually going on in the future. So example of leading indicators, these things will help predict what's going to happen in the future. So we've probably talked about a couple of these already, but those first order effects, I would argue, are the kind of leading indicators. Lagging indicators, though, are things that most people would lump to this sort of moniker brand, but likability, retention, customer retention, very much a lagging indicator. Willingness to collaborate with that brand and those kind of things. This partner referral effect will happen. Very much a lagging indicator as well. I would also split sort of your measurement into these two camps as well. I mean, this is a good example, isn't it?
Well, when they predict the future, they sometimes also predict decline in the future as well.
They do.
If you segment them correctly, as in, and a leading indicator of like website traffic is a leading indicator of your sales. Yeah. We also used to do something around, how many people are we getting new into market, because that's going to be your new market share.
Yeah.
But that one's a little bit more difficult.
New customer growth, yeah, it's a really good one. It's a really good leading indicator of penetration and market share growth in the future. And I think a really good one here is like this mental model around average sales cycle. So I think the key thing everyone needs to know, no matter what you work in, B2B, B2C, whatever, you really need to know what is that sort of window of people being in market versus out of market, and how long does that take to close? So for example, if I was in the cola or beverage market, I think what is a frequent buyer would be like, what, twice a year or something? Is actually really, really low, isn't it?
It's really small. Yeah.
Yeah. So the average sales cycle would be like literally 6 months for a frequent buyer of cola, which is crazy when you think about it, isn't it?
But there's at the same time, if you ask the average marketer, like, what's the average buying cycle of your customers, they wouldn't know.
No idea.
And it's actually really difficult to figure out the real answer, but you can kind of cut and copy it by, figuring out how many buyers did you have this week versus how many buyers are there in a year, and be like, okay, it's generally 5% of the market's going to be in market here, 95% are not in market. But knowing your category is just as important as knowing your brand and your customers.
It's so important. And each the key point here is that each product category that you're working in, or each market, has a very different average buying cycle, sales cycle. So like, for example, CRMs, when it comes to, HubSpot or Salesforce or whatever, like literally it's years, right? Houses would be like 12 or 13 years. Cars would be like 5 years, for example. So like the sales cycle, I think, almost like longer than the average tenure of the head of marketing, right? That's really key. And it can be a lot longer than you probably think. But that is a really good indicator of adjusting forecasts. And if you don't know that, then you're going to have a real problem forecasting accurately, I would argue.
And a good thing about understanding the customer buying cycle is if you measure it once, you probably only need to measure it every 10 years, just to check. Because it might move by 0.1, but it's one of those things, if you measure it correctly,
it doesn't change that much.
It's unlikely to change that much.
Yes,
unless there's some big incumbent thing, like I'm sure that ChatGPT kind of caused a lot of services to have it go out of whack.
Exactly. And I think the key thing here is that when you're measuring effectiveness, like to know your total market, or SOM, or SAM, or TAM, or whatever you want to call it, but the total size of your market versus the average sales cycle will give you the amount of customers that you could win at any one point in time. And you can predict this via this graph here on the right that Dale has created here. But basically it says like anything that you create in like quarter one on the bottom left, 90% of the revenue was realized in the third quarter, right? So you've got to wait a long period of time before anything you've spent in those first 2 quarters is actually realized. And this is why it's really important when you're measuring these like thin time windows. Even quarterly here, it could be completely different ROI based on your window.
And I can see people, you know, a false flag to go for is people are going to condense all of these learnings down into one number that they can go for and be like, is that number go up? Is that
Yeah,
number
it's a
go down?
5%. It's
But it's
95,
about
5, whatever.
but it's about being dynamic and in understanding how the market factors change. Like you have to know the macro as much as the micro.
Yeah, big time.
You've got some stuff on that in a second.
Yeah, I do actually. So coming back to advertising, very interesting study here, 2009. You can look at this. It's actually quoted in Aaron Bass Institute, but basically he was trying to figure out what is the return on investment of advertising campaigns, right? And basically they did a big study here, and they figured out that by about week 4, so if I did all my advertising, right, 4 weeks later, whatever effect I had over that 4-week period, I could say that another 50% of that would happen in the long tail. So basically the half-life of week 4 means I could then forecast the other return on that investment over a longer period of time. So I think a lot of people, when they say, oh, well, this campaign will wear in or this campaign will give returns in the future, they can never tell you exactly how long in the future that would take. Whereas I would argue, based on this study, that by about week 4, you'd be able to tell your CFO exactly how much return you get from that.
Technically, so there are other ways of measuring this if you can't measure it so discreetly and so concretely. Is that if you measure campaign metrics, as in, do people recognize this ad? Do you recognize the campaign? Do you know what the ad is talking about? Every time I've been measuring them for a big company, the build-up happens over a 4-week period until it actually is noticeable. So it appears in other order effects more than sales, because in a big company, it's really hard to measure. They've got to use other order effects to be able to make sure you can measure it properly.
Yeah, that's a good point. But as a general rule of thumb, if you want to give your a bit of a projection on your expenditure of whatever campaign you're invested in, I mean, this is a really rough barometer to use that I think a lot of people maybe are not familiar with. So, and that brings us to volume vanity. So I think a lot of people hate on volume metrics like traffic or impressions or brand awareness, whatever. But I think, that's the thing that actually keeps you in the position. So it's necessary. It's a necessary evil. And it sounds good when you're doing reporting and it impresses people. So it has political value. The things they care about really is the commercial impact. So, what financial return that has, what's the optics, all those other kind of things. And I think another mental model is I'd be thinking about this duality between let's impress people with the volume vanity metrics, but also address these commercial metrics underneath to the people that actually care about them. And then you kind of get the best of both worlds. I think a lot of people when they report, they just go one or the other. And I think that's probably a good way to do it.
I'd agree with that. You got to make sure you know what to dazzle them with, and then what to bring them back down to reality with.
Yeah, probably two different stakeholder groups here. Very interesting though. So I think the vanity metrics, really good idea. Here's a really good example. So when people talk about sales funnels, they talk about this linear effect here of like putting more in the top of funnel will lead down into these sequential stages to the bottom of funnel, right? So there's a really good argument for like increasing what many would argue is brand advertising and brand marketing effects on the top. So more on the top, more on the bottom. It's a linear stepped process, right? That looks kind of like this. But if you look at the data, that's exactly not how it works. This is the reality of it. So putting more on the top really doesn't lead to much more. And each step it reduces in this nonlinear effect. So you can kind of see here the shape, which is very different. It kind of reminds me of something.
But replace leads with any other sort of metric like website visits. How many people started buying? How many people actually bought?
Yeah.
Same thing. Even actually, to be fair, it's even more extreme than that. That low case is probably more accurate.
Yeah, low case I would say is kind of more my experience as well. So there's a high case and low case here of like averages between B2B firms. You can look at the study if you really want to see. And again, here's another example of reality. This person was trying to get a mate on Tinder versus swipes. So you can kind of see if we're using the metaphor here of like sales approaches, right? So swipes would putting a post out and getting swipes would be like a sales effect. Right swipes was a 132 of 1,111. So almost like 10%, just over 10% actually accepted that profile, and 7 people matched. From there, 2 people messaged, and from there, 2 conversations and 0 dates. So I think there's a really good metaphor for, hey, our campaign is a success. We got like 1,243 visitors to our website. But, the question will inevitably be asked by CEO, CFO. So how many customers do we get? And you basically from this, you have 0. You got 2 leads and like 0, 2 SQLs or 7 MQLs, 2 SQLs and 0 sales.
Talk to anybody in sales there and they'll tell you it's a numbers game, just like this.
It's exactly like that. And again, I think the key point here is that it's very unattractive to say, hey, we got 0 sales off this, very large investment. It's better to say, hey, well, we got 1,243 swipes, right? It's a success. And that's kind of the point I'm making about these volume versus commercial metrics, this dance that you need to do. So 6th mental model, I think this is how a lot of marketers approach things. They're going, hey, this brand has this massive halo effect on everything else. Then there's marketing, then there's like everything else in business. And it's all about brand, right? But what does the data say? Data says that category actually drives most of your effectiveness. So the ROAS from advertising here was basically mostly correlated with the increase in demand for the category itself as opposed to the ads, meaning that most of your growth is not about you or your ads, your brand, or whatever. It's basically just the market growing. I have to say that's also my experience. Interesting here. This is a screenshot from a real client who advises somebody, and this is Tracksuit. So they track brand awareness and liking, all those kind of things. That's what those colored lines are. Now, the dotted green line is the thing that they have historically always asked the audience, which is it's a category, in-market category test going, hey, for this product, how many times in the last X months have you actually been wanting to purchase that thing? So what it is a really good baseline for category demand going, well, how many people are in market for this product category at any one point in time, which affects every single competitor in the market. And you can kind of see here, it starts at 50% over left on August 23, and then June 25, you can see it's almost decreased by 10%, meaning the whole category has declined by 10%, regardless of how much brand awareness and mental availability or physical availability you have. You are at the whim of that macro effect of category demand for any of your sales effects. So unless you're tracking that, it can be that sort of like red herring that sort of rears its ugly head that I think if you're tracking this, knew this, that your CFO would very much be friends with you.
A lot of stuff that Dale puts out about market share change and everything else like that is a lot of the market share doesn't move over time. Over a 10-year period, your brand doesn't move. And the thing that moves is the category growing or the category declining, as in the literal amount of people buying from the category or not. And so the sales changes that you're seeing, all that marketing you're doing is staying at the same market share point, but you are at the behest of how fast the category is declining or growing at any one point. It's really important to know that. And a takeaway here is not enough people measure the category they're in at all. Part of marketing is to measure the market, not just your brand.
Yeah, and I mean, that's kind of what this is alluding to as well, that Kate was posting about. So really interesting. The takeaway is to always have a measure of the category or macro market growth rate because that sort of creates that halo effect. Here's a really good example of it tactically. May have used LinkedIn before. So February 24 to February 25 is the time period here, but you can kind of see here at average reach was like 110 index going down to like 50. So that's like basically halved in 12 months, meaning it doesn't matter the quality of your post or how many followers you have or anything, the macro effect on all your reach has basically halved over the 12-month period. So that's really important if you're investing a lot of money in that channel, because you've lost 50% yield, or what is it, almost 10% a month, month over month over that period, that you need to be adjusted in your calculations when you're measuring effectiveness.
Oh no, it's the algorithm change, John.
Yes, yeah, it is. But I would say it's probably even gotten worse there. I'm probably going to see those next 6 months. But so I would argue the reality, instead of like we're talking about this, where you think brand is this halo effect that cures all ills, and marketing is really important, and business, whatever. The reality is more like this: the macro economy has the biggest effect. Micro changes within your product category is the next biggest. Then your brand halo effect fits over that, and then you got product market fit. and then you've got your advertising and operations and everything else that fits underneath there. So that's the way I would probably think about it more so. And I think a lot of people have that reversed. This guy's very interesting, Ross Sargent, who works for a very large gambling firm, I think it is, like lottery firm in Europe. But he says, like, I think very eloquently, the point I'm trying to make here is that if you're reporting to very smart, financially trained people like CFOs and CEOs, they're going to see through a lot of these things very quickly and all of these fake metrics. So be very careful about what metrics that you are measuring and reporting to based on that. And again, ninth mental model, the second last one, most businesses these days are intangible asset based. So if you're not measuring these intangibles, then you are at a disadvantage. So a lot of these brand effects are intangible things, very much need a measurement system around those. Otherwise, you are basically reporting on physical assets, which is 10% of the market or less.
It goes back to like the second and third order effects though. Like they hope that brand captures everything, but there's always the second order, third order effects. And like if your brand is 90% intangible, it does do other things other than just the first part.
Functional benefit. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If I was the head of marketing, whatever, I would be going, hey, I need to keep the lights on, right? So a lot of the firm is around these optics, around making things look pretty or having a presence on certain mediums to say, hey, we're on Facebook, we're on this, we're on LinkedIn, we're retargeting on YouTube or whatever, like we're present, right? We're here. And that will be that sort of sustainment budget. I would then argue that I would try to argue for another portion of the budget for that incremental side of things and be very purposeful about how much that is and what it's used for. So that first portion is just to keep the lights on, keep you where you are right now and sustain. And then anything you want to grow, then you'd have a separate budget for and separate measurement system that is more about like net customer acquisition, new logos, very risky experimental sort of channel investments, that kind of thing, with a customer sort of brand penetration focus, I would say. So your house is basically being extended. That's the way I would then report on marketing effectiveness as well.
I've seen a lot of people have different ways of kind of experimenting with their budget. It's very difficult to get 30% of something signed off to be, going for a big bet. Like 10% is great. 10% is really good. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think this percentage will definitely vary based on the risk profile, and maybe for smaller brands, maybe it'd be a bit higher on that right-hand side. But I think that it's a good discussion to have going, hey, keep the lights on, servicing the internal sort of stakeholders versus, okay, net growth. What are we going to do about this? These are the risky big bets that often fail. And if they do succeed, then they actually grow the business. So very different kind of two measurement systems, I would say. And that's why I try to split the effects between these three things. So that right-hand side, I would say, would be more earnings focused, but you also need to have the political optics and pandering to egos within the firm to sustain your position and the function itself, similar to this, Indonesian aura guy. So you need to have that aura of like being new and cool and hip and up to date with, the latest AI and whatever channels. But, if you're talking to those financial people, you need to have those earnings effects as well. So it's that sort of interdance between those three circles. And it's funny about, where to put the stresses on your budget and then measurement as well. And that brings us to how you measure. Very important. It's almost more important than what you measure because, are you trusting someone to mark their own homework that you're paying for? Or are you doing it yourself? Like, how independent is that? What are the guardrails around that? Matt, you probably have some good examples of measurement that can go astray, right?
Yeah, I mean, like make sure make sure your homework is not being marked by somebody else, but then also like make sure you're who you're talking to is. Yeah, it's a fine balance for what I can say and what I can't say.
Okay, what's that example when you tested a panel provider around brand tracking and then you found out to be?
So I found a panel provider who.
So what's the panel provider, by the way?
I won't name who it is, but the respondents were coming back with something that was too. The respondents are open-ended questions, so they can respond how they want, and they were too good. They were too nice. When people do surveys, they type them in really quickly and they just want to get paid. And a lot of the surveys that come back, they were grammatically correct with well-structured and had, dot points at the end, like to end the sentence. And I said, these aren't real people. These aren't real people. Doesn't matter how much they're going through. And so I was paying for what I would call AI responses, which is difficult to have a conversation with, and then it's only going to get worse. You spoke about earlier in the presentation about how everyone's going back to events. With market research, you might have to go back to phone calls.
I think so, like in unfakeable kind of respondents, basically. A lot of these brand tracking firms and synthetic research providers will give you something that's not representative of the actual market, which is pretty misleading, I would say. And not always to their detriment, just because the people who sign up to these programs are using AI to monetize their situation as opposed to intentional sort of dilution. Very interesting. Yeah, just to summarize the 7 takeaways from tonight's presentation.